right, it looks like people are still coming in a little bit, but we're going to go ahead and get started since it's a little after 2 o'clock now. Welcome to this webinar on building resilience. What is your grounding? Today, we're going to explore how values and agency can enhance resilience through adversity and loss. My name is Jesse Bassett, and I am the Director of Education at Good Grief. And I am just blown away by the number of people who registered for this webinar ahead of time and are here joining us today. And so grateful to each of you for setting aside the time to engage in an incredibly important and I think timely topic given the circumstances that we find ourselves in. For those of you who are maybe new to Good Grief, we are a nonprofit organization that has been around in New Jersey since 2004. Our mission is to build resilience in children, strengthen families, and empower communities to grow from loss and adversity. For most of the organization's history, we've been providing free and limited support programs to grieving children and families, starting as young as 3 years old through young adulthood and their primary caregivers. In recent years, our work has been growing through education and advocacy to provide training, curriculum, and resources to schools, funeral industry, workplaces, and other spaces to empower professionals, parents, and the broader community to support the needs of children facing loss and adversity. In this webinar today is coming from our Good Grief Schools initiative, which includes programming and curriculum to support grieving students within the school, a social and emotional learning program to build adaptive life skills within students in classrooms, and parent and professional workshops to empower them to support their kids. So I will be providing a webinar info session on this program in Good Grief Schools in 2 weeks, which I invite you to join us to learn more. And as always, if you're interested in learning more about the organization and our work, please visit our website. You see it at the bottom of the screen there. So I just wanted to, at the very front of these webinars, talk about the purpose of hosting these webinars. We had a few reasons we wanted to offer this series. First and foremost, we find ourselves in a uniquely challenging moment. For some in our society, it's hitting harder than others, but we are all affected in various ways. And as educators and caregivers to our students and our families, I know for a fact that we can often forget to care for ourselves along the way. We are not the priority, the kids are, and I get that. But I love this metaphor of this visual that you see on your screen of the flight attendant. And the flight attendant, which unfortunately we can't get on planes these days, but if you could, they would get up and right before you take off, they would show you how to buckle your seatbelt like you've never buckled your seatbelt in your life. But then they would also give some instructions on something very important, which is how to put on your oxygen mask. And the thing that they always tell you on an airplane is that you always have to put on your own oxygen mask first before what? Before helping someone else. And in particular, before helping children. Now, this goes against our most basic intuitions as parents, caregivers, educators, human beings. If the plane is going down, my instinct is to reach over and to help out my 2 little girls. But we know that if the plane is going down and we lose oxygen, I'm not going to be any good to my 2 little girls if I pass out. So we have to care for ourselves first before we can care for others. So my first purpose for these webinars is that I wanted to give everybody who's involved in this an experience that I'm hoping will foster personal and professional growth. So we're going to start with you. The second goal of these webinars is to add some tools to your toolbox. And I'm going to do this through providing you with some good information, grief, loss, and resiliency. But we're also going to be doing some activities along the way that you can take back with you and use with students, family members, whoever it might be. So I'm hoping to add some tools to your toolbox as well. So let's jump into it. Our learning goals for today. I want to define resilience and the core elements that make up resilient responses, examine the impact of our current COVID-19 context and the broader landscape of adversities that individuals face, explore the role of values and agency and how they play their role in resilience through an individual story. So I'm going to read a story to us that will shape the activity that we will do, and then share strategies for staying grounded in core values and reclaiming a sense of agency. So I've got a packed agenda, but I am going to leave some time at the end for some Q&A as well. So I'm going to move through some content. I'll ask for some responses in the chat along the way. So if you don't have the chat pulled up, go ahead and pull that up. I have it open on mine, and I will ask us some questions. You could type into the chat there. And at the end, when we do the Q&A, there's a little Q&A button on the Zoom webinar, and you can type questions into that, and I'll do my best to get through as many of those questions as I can. But as always, and I'll say this at the end, if you have questions that I can't get to just because of timing, feel free to reach out to me personally via email. I will have my email at the end of this webinar as well. All right, so what is resilience? And maybe we could just get a few responses in the chat. What is resilience? How would you define resilience? See, bouncing back from trauma, grit, ability to adapt to change, maintaining strength, bouncing back, moving forward, come back after trauma. So see trauma coming up a couple times, focusing on goals, seeing options. Excellent. Yeah, a lot of good ideas. I see one there about being unaffected. That's a really interesting idea, this idea of being unaffected, that we kind of have this notion that somebody who's resilient isn't affected by the difficult things around them. But I think one of the things that we're going to learn today is that we are actually affected by loss and adversity in really significant and profound ways. And resilience isn't so much about being unaffected, but more about what do we do when we are affected? How do we continue to move forward in spite of our circumstances? So I'm going to do a little bit of defining here. Resilience stems from a Latin verb, as so many of our words do, that means to rebound. And in English, the word resiliency refers to the property of elasticity or springing back, much like a rubber band after it's been stretched. Resilience is, we like to say at Good Grief, utilizing inner strengths and external resources in order to overcome seriously adverse, even traumatic circumstances, and to continue living a healthy, productive, and meaningful life. And there are many different images of resilience. A couple that we like, this one's been mentioned already, a rubber band that gets stretched further and further and further. Eventually that rubber band would break, but a resilient person knows how to be stretched without breaking and to be able to rebound after having been stretched. Same with a tree. Love the image of the tree. And the question is, how deep are your roots? So when the storms come, what are those things that are going to keep you grounded and rooted? So that very much kind of plays along with our theme for today is, what is your grounding? Another way to ask that question would be, how deep are your roots? What are those things that are going to keep you grounded and rooted so that when life storms come your way, you won't just topple over? Now, there are many different elements of resilience. If you look at the literature, they point to lots of different things that make up resilient responses and determine whether or not someone will exhibit resilience. But the two primary kind of categories, when you really look at the literature that you can point to, are, are they surrounded by supportive relationships? And those supportive relationships ideally are going to be within the home, right? So a parent, caregiver, someone like that, especially for a child, do they have supportive caregiving relationships in the home? But the research also points to the fact that educators, role models, coaches, other folks like that can play that role as well. So that's really good news. The second thing that determines whether or not an individual exhibits resilience is adaptive life skills. And those include things like mindful awareness, emotion regulation, healthy coping, being grounded in your sense of character and purpose, having empathy for others, and more. So today, I'm going to focus in on one aspect of adaptive skill building, which is how to cultivate and practice staying grounded in values and our sense of purpose and meaning, even when adversity and loss come our way. And we find ourselves in a moment, as I've already named, that is a uniquely challenging one with this coronavirus pandemic. We are in isolation from one another. Jobs have been lost. People are juggling work and homeschooling. People are getting sick. People are dying. And we are all more keenly aware of the fragility of life. We're all having to make significant adjustments to this new reality. And for our children, even if they are not carrying the same uncertainties or know all of the difficult things that are going on in the world, they have their own difficulties and uncertainties that they carry, and they pick up on the stresses and overwhelm and fears that their parents and other caregivers are surrounding them with. So it would only make sense that there's a lot of stress and uncertainty about the future. And I think it's fair to say that we are in a time of collective grieving. Grief is most commonly associated with emotions, a lot of different emotions associated with grief: sadness, anger, isolation, stress, uncertainty, fear, even relief at times. Any of those sound familiar to this particular moment? But grief is more than just an emotional response. It's an intellectual response, spiritual, and a physical response. And I think we are all collectively experiencing these things as well. So the intellectual process is trying to understand the reality and the permanence of the loss or our new circumstances that we find ourselves in. The spiritual aspect of grief is how we make sense, how we make meaning out of difficult and terrible things that happen in our lives. And the physical response of grief is the headaches, stomach aches, difficulty sleeping, the stress response, all of that is taking place. So it's important for all of us to know today that this is a healthy adaptive response. We need to grieve in order to be resilient. We often see grief as this inherently bad thing, but in reality, it's a process that we need to undergo to adjust. This is why we are called good grief. It's not because of Charlie Brown. It's because of this belief that we have as an organization, is a core philosophy of who we are, that grief is a good and important process that we need to go through in order to rebuild after loss. So not a pathology. Now, it's also important for me to name at the beginning of our time together too, that we are all bringing with us a variety of different losses and adversities that we've faced that are going to determine how we respond to this particular moment. And this particular moment is going to impact these things as well. And the statistics through the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, among others, through the CDC, show us that when combined, 75% of children will face one or more of these hardships by the age of 20. So things like addiction, abuse, loss of home or moving, domestic violence, death of someone in their life, poverty, neglect, etc. And of those 75% of kids who experience at least one of these, 80% of those children will experience more than one. And 50% of kids who grew up with one adverse experience will be exposed to 3 or more. So if it ever feels like the world is a little unfair to some people, the world seems to just be against some kids and they have a lot more adversities that come their way, the statistics show that that's actually true, that these things have a way of compiling and cascading in an individual's life. So, adapting to adversity. What happens to children, teenagers, and adults when they go through these experiences of adversity, loss, and trauma? How do we tend to respond? First and foremost, it's important for me to communicate that humans are incredibly resilient. Research shows that the majority of individuals adapt to adverse experiences very well, particularly when they are surrounded by supportive caregivers, friends, and community. The second thing everyone should know is that each individual responds uniquely and differently. We are all unique human beings with unique stories and histories. And this is true even within a single family unit. So there might be some tuning in today and wondering why they're taking this whole thing so much harder than others in their family. Maybe you feel a lot more stress, fear, uncertainty. Everybody else seems to be fairly okay with it all. There's nothing wrong with you. We all respond differently to different stressors in our lives. And many factors are at play here, including the age, maturity, nature of the loss or adversity, your mental and spiritual health, quality of relationships from caregivers and parents and mentors that surround you, quality of social supports like schools and other spaces, level of emotion understanding, culture and religious traditions, prior exposure to loss and adversity in your life, and more. So we can't assume that we're all going to respond the same way, even within a single family. So adaptation is a highly unique process for individuals. It's also important for me to name, as we kind of start this conversation about resilience, that we have a certain conception of how we get over or get through difficult, adverse, or even traumatic experiences. Most of us look at adversity, loss, suffering through a binary lens, meaning we tend to think of it only in terms of good and bad. All adversity is only bad, and we need to figure out how to get rid of it or to get over it so we can get back to quote unquote normal again. I'm sure you've heard this before. The reality is that there is no getting back to normal the way that normal used to be. This is why it's called adapting. We have to learn to live with this new reality and make meaning out of this new reality that we find ourselves in. And two psychologists who have done a lot of work in this field are Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. And they've been the leading voices in the field of post-traumatic growth for some time. And they've done some significant research on trauma. And as they dug through their research and interviewed more than 600 trauma survivors, patterns began to emerge, including reports of lots of positive changes. Traumatic experiences, while incredibly challenging, also present significant opportunities for growth, they found. So suffering was only part of the change that was brought about by these experiences. In fact, suffering was a part of a much larger experience, which often proved to be a catalyst that pushed people to find new meaning in their lives. So a paradox of human nature is that the most difficult moments in our lives are often more defining in shaping our sense of identity and meaning and purpose in the world. And some of the common changes they observed when they studied trauma survivors were these: increased inner strength, an openness to new possibilities in life, closer and deeper relationships with friends and family, an enhanced appreciation for life, and a stronger sense of spirituality. Pretty amazing things. Now, I'm not trying to diminish the impact of how difficult adversity, loss, and trauma can be. Of course, these things are incredibly difficult and should not be taken lightly. But if we understand and keep the perspective that these experiences are also opportunities for growth and change, it will help us to remember that we are capable of not only getting through this, and this being this COVID-19 pandemic, any other kind of losses and adversities that you might experience in your life, that we are not only capable of getting through them, but also growing through them as well. What helps us to make, so question, what helps us to make these positive adaptations? One of the things that the research points to is that individuals who have a firm foundation in their values and their sense of purpose tend to see a lot of these positive changes. So that's what we're going to explore next in our time together, and was kind of the primary question that I had for this webinar. What is your grounding? What is the thing that you are grounded in that helps you to weather the storms that might come your way? And so to start this conversation, I want to read a story about an individual that I think many of you have probably heard of before, but if you haven't, it might spur you to go and check out some of his work in his book. His name is Viktor Frankl. And Viktor Frankl was born in 1905 in Vienna, Austria. He's a neurologist and psychologist and a Holocaust survivor. So he went through World War II. And he wrote what has been considered one of the most influential books in modern American history, called Man's Search for Meaning. And if you haven't read that book, highly encourage you to check it out. It's a great read. And so to start this conversation on values, agency, and being grounded in those things through adversity and loss, what I want to do is read you a bit of his story. So I'm going to read for just a short little while. So if you need to find a comfortable position, whatever it might be, that's fine. So I'm going to read his story, and then I'm going to prompt us with some questions, and then we're going to do a brief kind of reflective writing activity afterward as a way to follow up from it. So I'm going to read, and then we will continue. In 1905, Viktor Frankl was born the middle child of a Jewish family in Vienna. His parents were government employees, and the family was fairly comfortable. Prior to the Second World War, Frankl built a fairly successful career for himself as a psychologist in Austria. But in 1938, Germany invaded Austria, and Frankl was waiting to hear the news that would lift him out of this terrifying situation that so many European Jews were in. He had applied for a visa to the United States and just needed his lottery number to be called. And he was one of the lucky ones. His lottery number came up just before Pearl Harbor and the United States entrance into the war. But Victor's decision to leave Austria wasn't easy. The visa applied only to him, not to any other members of his family. His parents and siblings would be left behind, and Victor knew that their fate was likely to end in a concentration camp. He had a choice to make. Guided by his religious beliefs and family loyalty, he decided to stay in Austria. Then, in 1942, what Victor had feared most came to be true. He, his wife, and his parents were arrested and eventually ended up at Auschwitz. He was one of the few to survive Auschwitz. 1.3 million people were sent through its gates, and 1.1 million people died. Those who didn't die right away in the gas chambers suffered through deaths caused by starvation, disease, exhaustion, forced labor, and cruel medical experiments. In his book, Frankl tells of the horrors of the life in the camp, how the Nazis systematically dehumanized each prisoner, beating them, working them until they had nothing left, and his own struggle to survive. And this is what he said: "Under the influence of a world which has no longer recognized the value of human life and human dignity, which has robbed individuals of their will and made them an object to be exterminated, under this influence, the personal ego finally suffers a loss of values. If the person in the concentration camp did not struggle against this in a last effort to save their self-respect, they lost the feeling of being an individual, a being with a mind, an inner freedom, and personal value. The person thought of themselves as only part of an enormous mass of people. Their existence descended to the level of animal life." One evening, almost by accident, Frankl discovers something that would save his life. As he marched back from work detail that evening, he was in terrible pain. His feet were covered with sores, shoes torn, with a bitterly cold wind bearing down on him. He obsessed over the tiny things he needed to do in order to survive. And in the midst of those complex calculations of survival, an image came to him. He saw a detailed and clear vision of himself giving a lecture after the war on the psychology of the concentration camp. And that changed how he viewed everything around him. He is quoted as saying, "All that oppressed me at that moment became objective, seen as described from the remote viewpoint of science. By this method, I succeeded in rising above the situation, above the sufferings of the moment," he wrote. He also thought about his wife and his love for her. He thought a lot about his inner life, about dignity and conduct and his values. And he remembered a quote from Nietzsche, who once wrote, "He who has a why to live can bear with almost any how." It was not just a call to find meaning. Meaning was not a luxury for Frankl. It was the difference between life and death. Frankl's impact and his influence, it could be argued, was the result of values and choices that he made throughout his life. The first significant choice in our story was that he chose to stay in Austria with his family, despite the risks. He also chose to stay centered in his values, regardless of his circumstances. And finally, he made a choice to take the horrible circumstances that were thrust upon him and use them for good through his book. There are a couple of quotes from Frankl that I want to share before we go into our reflective writing. He's quoted as saying this: "Between stimulus and response, there is a space, And in that space is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom. And right now, we are in the midst of a time when we have a lot of stimulus that have been thrown our way that are incredibly difficult. And it can be hard to know where our freedom continues to lie. So I love this quote: between the stimulus and response, there is this space. And in this space is our power to choose our response. And there is our freedom. Another quote from him is: everything can be taken from a person, but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. And so this is the question that I have for us today, the question that Viktor Frankl wrestled with when he was going through the concentration camps during World War II. What is your why for living? I love this quote from Nietzsche: those who have a why to live can bear with almost any how. Values are our compass when things get hard. Values help to keep us grounded. So our question is, what is your why? And so we're going to do a little activity now together, a self-reflective activity, to define some of our own values. And I have a few tips for you as you think about doing that. First and foremost, values should be things that cannot be taken from you and are often immaterial. You want to choose values that are authentic and true to you, but you also want to think about ones that enhance resilience. And the reality is, things that are material and things that can be taken from us are things like money, possessions, or even success. All of these can go away, and often go away because of difficulties or adversities that we might face. Another tip is we should think about values that are connected to our larger sense of meaning and purpose in the world. Why are you here? What is the purpose of your life? What matters to you most? So things like family, community, love, compassion, and others. And my final tip for you is this: these values that we identify should pass what we call the stress test. So these will remain intact and important regardless of adversities that may come your way. Again, going back to the example of like money, possessions, success, these are things that can be taken from us. And in recent experience, many of these things have been taken from us. And so we should try to identify some values, core values, that can stay with us regardless of our circumstances. Thinking of the example of Viktor Frankl as kind of a guiding post there. I wanted to share just a few values from Good Grief as an organization, because sometimes just seeing some values words helps people to kind of prompt their thinking. So these are values that are important to the organization, our agency, in our work. Things like honesty, empathy, compassion, support, patience, and community. So think about maybe capturing some of those values, but you can also, if you're on your computer, you can Google search, and you'll have some time to think about this. I'm going to give you some prompts to think about it beyond our time together as well. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to do a little reflective writing activity. I'd like you to pull out a piece of paper if you have one. Just be like a blank piece of paper, or open up a new Word document, something like that on your computer, anywhere that you can jot notes. It's really you don't have to be too worried about all the details of that. Put a title at the top if you want, My Core Values. And what we're going to do is I'm going to have you brainstorm a list of your own values. Don't hold back or worry about editing. That's not where we're at in this process. It's just about getting things down on the page. I'm going to have you reflect and write for about 3 minutes. And I'm going to play some music while you do that. So the music will come through on your speakers, and you can adjust the volume however you like. Find a quiet place if you can. I know it's kind of hard these days being at home with lots of other people, potentially. But if you can, find a quiet space, get comfortable, get a piece of paper, a pen, open up a new Word document, and I'm going to play some music for 3 minutes, and then I'll bring us back together. And I'm just going to turn off my video during that so it's not a distraction. And then I just want you to write and see what comes to you. And then I'll give us some further instruction after that. All right? Go ahead. Okay, everyone. About 3 minutes. Hopefully we've got a nice list of values down. If not, that's totally okay. This is something you can continue to work on after this webinar. And this is a fairly simple activity, obviously, just taking a piece of paper, Word document, and brainstorming a list of values. I have a few more tips for you to allow these things to continue to evolve and for how to stay grounded in them. So I just want to move into that now. And I want to name two before I move into that. This is something that you can do for yourself. This is also a great activity to use with even children and teenagers, something that we've done at Good Grief, to help them to kind of orient, like, what are the things that are important to them, and kind of helping them to recall some of those things when they're going through difficulties. So a few tips for allowing these things to evolve. Let's see if I can get this to move forward. There we go. So this is not a one-time event to identify values. In fact, it's an evolving process that will change over time with you, and that is okay. One of the best things you can do is to identify, one of the best things you can do in this process of allowing them to evolve is not to just be in your own head. So values are not created in isolation. So turn outward and refine your values through community activism, volunteering, being engaged in faith and religious communities, if that's something that's important to you, through family, friendships, and your vocation. All of these are spaces where values will be refined and shaped. But also important in the process is turning inward and engaging in meditation, reflection, journaling, things like that. All of those activities and experiences will help you to evolve your values and to keep those at the center of who you are. Now, when we're going through particularly stressful experiences, adversity, loss, how do we stay grounded in those values in very practical ways? This takes practice and it takes work. So we know that when the stress response system is activated through trauma, adversity, or loss, that part of our brain called the hypothalamus is responsible for the feeling and activating the fight or flight response that gets kicked into high gear through these kinds of experiences. And when that happens, the region of our brain that is responsible for regulation, reasoning, decision-making, and problem solving, called the frontal lobes, gets put on the back burner, basically. And this is why when we're really stressed and overwhelmed, it can be difficult to keep perspective, to calm down, and to make good choices. So in order to stay grounded in our values and sense of who we are and our purpose, we need to put those things into regular practice and use strategies to help us to reason and regulate. So my suggestion to you all is to, try this out for the next week, spend 5 to 10 minutes meditating daily. If you don't do that already, start now. And meditation, research has shown, is this incredible thing that reverses the negative physiological effects of chronic stress. So it helps to kind of restore the processes in the frontal lobes, helps us to reason and regulate, and it's going to help us to stay grounded in these values. You can use apps like Calm or YouTube videos to help you in that process if it's something that you don't feel very comfortable with. There's some great resources out there. And then as part of that meditation and mindfulness practice, I recommend that you make your values over this, try it out again over this next week, make them your mantra. So as an example, I'm going to stay grounded in, you're doing your deep breathing, self-compassion, in love, in empathy, and in family. And just see how it goes. See how you feel at the end of those meditation practices, at the end of the day. But that's a really practical way to stay grounded in your sense of purpose and who you are. Now, what about agency and choice? So when the world feels out of control, how do I gain some sense of control? Research tells us that even the perception of control in your life enhances resilience. So there are things that we can do to enhance that. A great activity that we do at Good Grief with kids and adults of all ages it's a pretty simple one. We just take out a piece of paper, divide it in half, and on one side you write things that I can't control, and the other side you write things that I can control, and then fill it out. So this is a picture of a child's hand, some things that They wrote down on their activity, so things that they can control, their attitude, how often they say thank you, how they interpret situations, how honest they are, how many times they smile that day. Some other examples for you. This is what it could look like. Things that I can't control, the events of the world, like this pandemic that we find ourselves in, adversities that you face, the thoughts and emotions that you experience in any given moment, the words or actions of others, how others think, speak, or act toward you, the things that you can control, how you respond to those events, how you cope with adversity, what you do with the thoughts and emotions that you have, your words and actions, and then how you think, speak, and act toward yourself. So this is a great activity, again, for reclaiming some of that agency, that sense of control when the world feels very out of control. Focus on the things that you can control, and we try to let go of the things that we can't control. So those are two activities that I had for you today that you can take with you. Somebody asked a question of whether or not this will be made available afterward. Yeah, I'm going to make the PowerPoint available as a handout so you can refer back to them. We've also recorded this session, and we'll probably be releasing that recording on our website, so you can also refer back to it there. We're moving into the end of our time now because I wanted to make sure that I left some time for some Q&A. Just want to kind of go back to our learning goals, make sure we covered everything. We wanted to define resilience and the core elements that make up resilient responses, examine the impact of our current situation with COVID-19 and the broader landscape adversities, explore the role of values and agency play in resilience. And we read the story of Viktor Frankl as a way to exemplify that. Share strategies for staying grounded in core values and reclaiming your sense of agency. So now I do want to move into some Q&A, and I'll have a little bit of info for you at the end about some upcoming stuff and resources that you can access via our website. But I'm just pulling up the Q&A tab here. So if you would either type into the chat or the Q&A box, there's a little Q&A button there, and I'd be happy to take any questions. I see one there. Do we earn professional development credit for attending? Unfortunately, no. I'm not. We weren't offering CEs through this workshop, but you are going to get an automated response tomorrow. That's kind of like a receipt that you attended. So if you need to show your attendance or proof of attendance, you will be getting an auto response email from that. Good Grief does offer professional development workshops. I'm running my next one this next Tuesday that are longer ones. Those workshops are paid workshops, and we do offer continuing education credits through those. So if you're interested in learning more about that, visit our website on the education page. Let's see, do you have activities to help students navigate through complex grief in its infant stage? Okay, so a couple of things going on with that question. One is this idea of complex grief in its early stages. So one of the things that we know about complex or complicated grief is that it's not something that can be identified until later on in a person's grief process. But then even at Good Grief, we have some real problems with the whole terminology of complicated and complex grief for a lot of different reasons, which we don't have a lot of time to get into for now. One thing I would say is helping young people to navigate through grief and loss, the things that they need most at a really young age. Again, going back to some of the things I named earlier, supportive caregiving relationships, people that they can talk to openly about their experience, share how they're feeling, things like that. They need to be able to process what's happened. And we do have some great activities on our website. You can download some free ones, but then we also have an activity book on there. And there's some other really good activity books in the field that help kids to process what they've gone through and to learn to develop healthy coping skills and to communicate those things to other people. All right, I'm seeing another question and I'm just reading it. I don't particularly care for the expressions new normal or new reality because that would imply that this pandemic and period of quarantine will last forever. So I've been telling my students that this is the current temporary routine. We will eventually reopen, including schools. So how would you handle a similar situation with students from your program? That's a good question, Laura. Thank you. Yeah, I think what I'm saying is by new normal or new reality is not that things will not go back to the way that they were, but more this idea that we can't pretend like this hasn't happened to us, right? We will all carry a certain amount of impact from this experience. So we will all be impacted from it in various ways. And I think one of the things that we want to be really careful about when we do go back to normal, when we do go back to school again, is we don't want to just go back to school and pretend like nothing happened, because a lot of students, a lot of young people and adults as well, when they come back into school, will be still carrying a lot of stress, anxiety, all of those kinds of things from this experience. And so we just want to make sure that we're creating a space for people to adapt, to process, and to communicate their needs with people that are going to support them. What do we do with overwhelming feelings of hopelessness at this time? That's a very good question. Yeah, I know for myself, I have at times felt incredibly hopeless. I have at times felt incredibly discouraged by all of this. So first and foremost, you are not alone in that experience. I think many of us are feeling that way. I would say a couple of things. One, I mean, just going back to this webinar, trying to stay grounded in our values and sense of purpose is incredibly important for rebuilding a sense of hope. I'm also going to be talking about holding on to hope in a future webinar. We haven't released that date yet, but that one is coming up. So stay tuned for that. The other thing I would say is connecting to people as much as you can. And I know that's really, really difficult right now, given social distancing and all of that. But even if it's done virtually, finding people that you can connect to and find shared experiences really does help with that sense of hopelessness and isolation. Can you offer any tips or resources for teachers on how to create a safe and supportive environment for students once schools reopen? Another really great question. There are some really great tips and resources that I would recommend to people on our website, good-grief.org, on creating a safe school environment, classroom, all of those kinds of things. There's a resources page, and I'm actually going to pull up a little image of that. So you go on the website, the resources tab, and there's all kinds of free PDFs to download for that very purpose. Another webinar that I'm planning in a few weeks here is one that's specifically about the transition back to school. And my plans for that webinar are we're going to bring in people from school that hold various roles, so counselor, administrator, teacher, etc., and talk about that transition and how we support them in that process. And I'll bring some thoughts from Good Grief, but I also want to bring in voices from the school community as well. So stay tuned for that. Are you guys offering virtual support groups that we can refer students to? Yes, we are offering virtual support groups. And if you want to find out whether or not your student qualifies for our virtual support groups, I would encourage you to visit our website on our program page. There's contact information there. You can also email to me, and I'm going to put my email into the chat here. Feel free to email me with any additional questions or referral information, jesse@good-grief.org. So we are running virtual groups, but even if your students don't qualify, if you have a group of students that you think might benefit from a group or from some of our programming, another thing that we are offering is our Good Grief Schools program. And again, I'm going to do a program info session in a couple weeks on that. But in that program, part of it is a grief support group program that we train counselors, social workers, other folks in the school to run a support group out of the school. So if that's something that you're interested in, you think you have a core group of students that could benefit from it, reach out to me and let me know, and I can answer any questions about that. There was a question about sending future webinars. Yep, there is actually going to be a link in the auto response to this webinar that's going to get sent to your email, and that's going to have the future webinar dates in it as well. So you will click on, it'll take you to the website and it'll tell you our future webinar dates, and we're going to continue to release more dates. I would encourage people too, if you have suggestions for us, there's going to be a survey when you log out of this. Please just take a few minutes to fill out the survey, and if you have any ideas or things that you would like us to cover in future webinars, I'd love to hear those, because if we can do that, then we will continue to run these webinars if people find them to be helpful. Let's Let's see, I'm just trying to find a couple of other questions that I haven't answered. Someone says they don't see my email. I'll type it again. It's jesse@good-grief.org, and it will also be in the auto email response that you see will come to you. Let's see. The email will be sent as an auto response once the webinar is complete. So that will come after this is done. Somebody says that they haven't seen the email yet, it'll come, and there will also be a second one that'll come to you tomorrow. All right. Any other questions that I haven't covered yet? Seeing some thank yous. Yeah, thank you everybody again for taking the time. I will hang around for about another minute or so if we have more questions. But otherwise, I just want to say thank you again. And I hope that this was, again, back to kind of my purpose for doing this, beneficial both personally for you, but also professionally. Take these activities and engage your students, engage people that you live and work with to stay grounded in your values, and do so through a meditation practice because of that stress that we're all experiencing, and use that as part of kind of a daily mantra. I'm hoping that the story of Viktor Frankl was inspiring to you and something that will help you to navigate through what I know has been an incredibly difficult time for everybody. In this last slide here, I've got our upcoming webinar dates that we have identified. The next one is next week on Thursday from 12 to 1. We're going to be talking about making meaning out of loss. So we'll be diving into a little bit different aspect of resiliency and how we make meaning. And I've got a great activity, again, for personal development and growth, but also something that you can use with young people as well. So that's next Thursday from 12 to 1. And then the following Wednesday, May 20th from 12 to 1, I'll be doing the Good Grief Schools info session. So talking about our grief support groups and also talking about our Roots to Resilience curriculum program and parent and professional workshops. And then for more info or to register, I'll see if I can copy this link here. Oh, it went away. I'm going to see if I can pull it up and put it into the thing for everybody. I'm still getting used to this whole virtual space. Sorry. All right. I'm going to put this link in there. That link is for all the future webinars. All right. Thank you again, everybody, so much. And I'm hoping that everybody who is here stays healthy and safe. And I look forward to hopefully seeing you all again very soon at a future webinar. All right. Have a good rest of your day.